Good morning, good evening, and good day. This is your host and producer, Roy of Hollywood, welcoming you to Something's Happening. And our engineer is Diane Schmidt. We have, as of March 11th, 1992, live in-studio guests, Mark Lane, who is originally known as the author of the best-selling book Rush to Judgment, the first book to come out that criticized the Warren Commission report and was a bestseller in the 60s. His latest book, not his second or third or fourth, but his latest book is The Plausible Denial, was the CIA involved in the assassination of JFK. And also we have Steve Jaffe, who is cohort.
Former investigator for Jim Garrison and photo analyst.
Photo analyst.
For Garrison, yeah.
Lots of work to do in this case. When I first got my notice that Plausible Denial was out, I was wondering, why are they sending this to KPFK? I expect that, Mark Lane is material for Oprah and Donahue and Geraldo and
well, they've been fighting to have me on, and I just didn't know which one to choose. I've almost been on no national programs. No publisher in America would publish Plausible Denial. Finally, Thunder's Mouth Press agreed to do it. And, every major – I'm represented by a really terrific agent, Scott Meredith, maybe the best literary agent in the history of America. He sent it out to every single publisher in America. If you want to know who refused to publish this book, every publisher in America, Simon & Schuster, which of course is Gulf Western, and all the rest of them. And Thunder's Mouth did it. It's a break in precedent for them. They published, for example, the 2-volume reprint of Langston Hughes' autobiography, that kind of work. And then they decided to do this, and I thought they were going to print about 5,000 copies. But there's a terrific guy in San Francisco, Charlie Winton, publishes Group West, the distributor, who played a major part in a lot of books on the Kennedy assassination being published by small publishers. He said, no, we can distribute more than that. So they printed 45,000. It came out the first week of November. Publication date was November 22nd. There was no radio advertising, no TV advertising, not a single show, nothing in the newspapers, just the books in the store, and they all sold out, 45,000 before November 22nd, before publication date. Now it's 250,000. The book's gone all the way up to the number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list.
They've allowed it on the list?
Well, they didn't for a long time, actually. We were, Chutzpah by Dershowitz was number 15 in America on the New York Times list. We watched that because that was number 15, and then it dropped off the list, and the next week it was back on the list, and we checked our records against his. We outsold his book by 3-1 in the chains, 2-1 in the independents, and his book moved on and ours didn't. I did a radio program in New York and said, the New York Times always talks about the mystique as to how they put that list together. When we file our lawsuit, the mystique will disappear as we take our depositions and find out how that's done. And the next week I was number 7, and then 6, then 5, then 4. And so New York Times was very responsive to threats and extortion, and there we are on the list now. Now I think it's going to be the 9th week now. But it's slipping down. Everybody go out and buy one, put it back high up on the list.
Okay, Thunder's Mouth Press did it. And I'm not a real close follower of the news, but I was really astounded by the information in this book. I figured it would be sort of a review and a recap of the review. And this is tremendous amounts of new information and sworn information and court record information that just blows the case out of the water.
It really does, yeah.
And no wonder it's being ignored.
Yeah. It's too serious for the news media to deal with, obviously. What it is, of course, is a trial. A man named Victor Marchetti, the highest-ranking official of the CIA, to leave the organization and write a book which was critical of it. I'm sure he's been on Pacifica a million times over the years. It uncovered a document which indicated that E. Howard Hunt, Watergate, Berg, the CIA officer, and the CIA itself had been involved in killing John Kennedy, and then he wrote the piece. Now, the New York Times did not publish it. No one published it, but a conservative right-wing publication called Spotlight published it. Spotlight had no real interest in the Kennedy assassination in 1978. They had never written a single word on the subject, but they knew Victor Marchetti to be a man who was responsible. They thought it was an interesting story which he had written, and they published it. And then E. Howard Hunt sued. He got a lawyer named Ellis Rubin. I think everybody knows who Ellis Rubin is, a somewhat flamboyant lawyer in Miami. People have said about Ellis Rubin that if you want to hide it from Ellis Rubin, put it in a law book. But I would never say a thing like that about Ellis. And he represented Mr. Hunt and tried the case. And they asked Liberty Lobby to back down and admit it was wrong. And they did not back down. Spotlight and Willis Carter did not back down. They said, no, we're going to try this case. And at the trial, they got a local lawyer, and they said there's a lack of actual malice. We don't have to defend this on the merits. There's no actual malice. Hunt testified at the trial. I was not involved in this at all. I didn't even know it was taking place. I didn't know about it until years later, that it had taken place. Hunt, however, I read the transcript since. Hunt said, when this newspaper was published, and he picked it up and showed it to the jury, brandished it in front of them. When this newspaper was published and it said that I killed John Kennedy, my 3 children came to me. They were all adolescents at the time of the assassination. They were all now grown. One was a lawyer. One was married to a lawyer. All 3 of them were adults. And they said, Dad, did you kill the president? Hunt said, I denied it, but I could not dissuade my children because they had read the Spotlight. Now, the first thing I think one has to wonder about is Mr. Hunt's relationship with his 3 children, why they would believe the Spotlight, a paper they had never read before, over the assertions of their own father, that he had killed the president, the Spotlight said, and he denied it. In any event, he finally said he had to try to prove to them that it wasn't true. They said it wouldn't be in the newspaper, Dad, if it wasn't true. In any event, as he was telling this, tears began to well up in his eyes, and he started to cry. And the jurors started to cry, and the judge started to cry. When the defense lawyers started to cry, everyone knew it was all over, and the jury awarded Mr. Hunt $650,000, perhaps a trifle extravagant for his reputation. He just had come out of jail for betraying the interests of the American people as a Watergate burglar, trying to subvert our system of justice. In any event, that was that. But Mr. Rubin, as I say, a brilliant scholar, his lawyer had told the judge that this is the way to instruct the jury about what these standards are, and the judge followed his advice, and it was all wrong. And so the United States Court of Appeals sent it back for a new trial. This judgment against Liberty Lobby had gotten the attention of the people at Spotlight and Liberty Lobby, Mr. Carter, Mr. Marchetti, and they asked me if I would represent them at the next trial. And I said, not on the basis of lack of actual malice. If you want to go into a struggle, I can prove, I think, to the satisfaction of a fair jury, the CIA killed John Kennedy. Will you give me the brief and let me do that? They said yes. And for the next year and a half, I took depositions from everybody who's made our lives a delight for a couple of decades. E. Howard Hunt, G. Gordon Liddy, Richard Helms, all honorable men, all high employees of the government, all criminals who betrayed the interests of the government, all of them have been convicted of one crime or another. And then we were ready for trial, and Mr. Hunt testified. And he was
depositions, when you take a deposition, they have to tell you the truth or they are guilty of perjury.
Well, they're supposed to tell the truth. Everybody who's under oath is supposed to tell the truth. This is like a trial. It's part of the trial process. And in the book, I describe how all of these things work in some detail. But in a thumbnail sketch now, a deposition is you have jurisdiction over a person who's within 100 miles of the federal court. If they're beyond that, you can't force them to come, but you can reach out wherever they are, in America, even out of America, and get an order from a court saying they have to answer questions. You go to where they are, and the other lawyer is there, and the court reporter is there, and the person is sworn in. And as you say, if they lie, they can be prosecuted for perjury, and a transcript is made of every question and answer. And we did all that for David Phillips, for example, who modestly proclaimed that he ran the Western Hemisphere for the CIA for 25 years. A lot of people lived here didn't know that at that time until Mr. Phillips told us what he was doing with our lives. That was all over. Then the trial began, and Mr. Hunt testified. He was terrific on direct examination. Everybody is terrific on direct examination. Then came cross. And I said, where were you November 22nd, 1963? And Mr. Hunt said, I was in Chinatown in Washington, D.C., my wife is buying Chinese food in a grocery store. I heard in the car on the radio that John Kennedy had been shot. I went back. I picked up my 3 children and my wife. We stayed in our family room in the shadows of Langley, the CIA headquarters, and we stayed there for 48 hours. And he said, no, I must correct myself. I was there for 72 hours, never left the room.
With his children?
With the 3 children, right. And I said, did you eat? Yes, we sent out for pizza and fried chicken. Then there was a bathroom right there. But we were together the whole time, 72 hours. I said, you remember your testimony at the first trial? He said, I did testify. I said, oh, yeah. You testified and you said that your children came to you with a newspaper some years later and said, Dad, did you kill the president when you were down there in Dallas at that time? And Mr. Hunt, you said they were with you during this unforgettable experience of the 72 hours eating fried chicken and pizza and watching the news about the death of the president. Why didn't your kids say, Dad, we're your alibi witnesses. We know this is a lie. Why did they say, you must have been there? Well, I think he realized it was a problem, and he didn't know how to answer. There's a long pause. He looked at his lawyers, but they were hiding under their table at that point. Then he looked at the jury. They looked like they were going to charge over the barricades and get him. Then he looked at me. He got very little comfort from me. He looked down at his feet. Then he finally said, yes, I had to remind my children they were my alibi witnesses. At that point, it seemed to me that the case was over for Mr. Hunt, but our case had just begun. And I said to my clients, let's forget about defending this defamation case. Let's prosecute a criminal case. Let's prove the CIA killed John Kennedy. And we put on the testimony of Marita Lorenz, who had been employed by the CIA to murder Fidel Castro, then worked for the CIA. She testified for years with E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, getting weapons in the United States, having them navigated down to anti-Castro forces in Cuba. And then she said in November 1963, Mr. Sturgis came to her and said, Marita, this is the big one. And it was a 2-car caravan that drove from Miami to Dallas, Texas. She gave the names of the people in the cars. Jerry Patrick Hemming, the Novos brothers. The Novos brothers later were convicted in complicity regarding the murder of Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. Jerry Patrick Hemming, a group of these people, all with their weapons, drove from Miami to Dallas. When they got to Dallas, they met E. Howard Hunt, who was the paymaster of the operation. Frank Sturgis, he said, was the field commander who led the troops there. She withdrew from the operation, but later she said, Sturgis came to her and said, Marita, you missed the big one. We killed Kennedy. It was a CIA hit, etc. Went through all the details. That was her testimony, and it was subjected to cross-examination. The jurors listened, and they believed that what she said was true. I believe that that's so because that's what they came out and said later when the trial was all over. We won the case. It was a 2-week trial. Much more evidence was submitted, of course, than that which I've touched upon here. The jury heard it all. They were chosen by both sides as being impartial. It's the first time the rule of law was applied to the facts surrounding the assassination of John Kennedy. A federal judge determined what was relevant. Both sides presented all the evidence and had a chance to cross-examine the witnesses. And when it was all over and we won unanimously, the jurors came out and the press surrounded the forewoman of the jury, Leslie Armstrong, and said, why did you reach the conclusion you did? And she said, we're now convinced the CIA killed President Kennedy. We were impartial when we were chosen. Mr. Lane said at the beginning he was going to show us evidence which implicated the CIA in the assassination. Frankly, I thought we would never be able to be convinced that our own government killed the president. We've heard the evidence. We're a privileged group of Americans, unlike the rest of America. We heard the evidence. A judge said it was relevant. That's what we could hear. It was all presented by both sides, and it was all subjected to cross-examination. We are now convinced the CIA killed President Kennedy. You did not read that in your local newspaper because it was not covered. And that's part of the trial. It's all of the trial and a lot of other material is the subject of the book, Plausible Denial, which tells what took place. Now, just recently, Steve Jaffe and John Barber here in Los Angeles located the telephone number of Jerry Patrick Hemming, who Marita said was in the 2-car caravan and went from Miami to Dallas. And I called him. Of course, he didn't have to talk to me, so I thought he might hang up. I said, is this Jerry Patrick Hemming? And he said, yes. I said, this is Mark Lane. He said, hi, Mark, how you doing? I said, I guess you didn't read my book. He said, I read your book. I read it. I said, what'd you think? He said, I liked it a lot. I said, well, Jerry, did you like the part where Marita said that there was a 2-car caravan, you were in it, and you guys went to Dallas and killed John Kennedy? He said she was a little bit wrong about that. I said, in what way? He said, Jerry thought for a minute. He said, it was a 3-car caravan. I said, were you in it? He said, I know about it. I'm not saying I was in it. I wasn't in it, but I know about it. I said, do you know anything else about the Kennedy assassination? He said, yes. Guy Bannister, special agent in charge of the FBI in Chicago, later retired, went to New Orleans and worked for the CIA. He said, Guy Bannister offered me a contract in September of 1962 to kill John Kennedy on behalf of the CIA. And I said, if there were a special prosecutor, he said, yes, if there were one, I'd come forward. I would testify. I would make that known. It's time the American people learned everything that happened that day. What we need now is a special prosecutor. I'm not sure George Bush is going to rush out and appoint one for us, but we need a special prosecutor. I know Oliver Stone believes that we have to free the JFK files, as he says. He thinks if 250 million Americans start looking through the papers, we're going to solve this crime. I've been saying since day one for 28 years, when Oliver Stone was wearing short pants and was in elementary school, I've been saying nothing should be suppressed. All of the evidence should be made available. But freeing the files is just the first step. It's not the last step. We must force the government to appoint a special prosecutor. If that process took place tonight, by the end of this year, the people who killed John F. Kennedy would be indicted and prosecuted and probably convicted because the evidence is there. A lot of it is there in plausible denial, and there's a lot of additional information. If you got Jerry Patrick Hemming, Marita Lorenz, Frank Sturgis, E. Howard Hunt to start out with and presented them to the grand jury, we would learn a lot about how the president was killed and why he was killed.
But if we appointed a special prosecutor, I'm thinking of the way the House Assassination Subcommittee was castrated and
right, we have
waylaid. And they'd say, okay, well, we can appoint special prosecutor Arlen Specter or something like that.
That
and
would be
have
good, yeah.
Another big investigation.
Well, we have to know who's going to be appointed. The first general counsel of the House Select Committee on Assassination was Dick Sprague of Philadelphia. I have absolute faith in him. He should be appointed special prosecutor. He was fired because he said he wanted to get the files of the FBI and the CIA, and they brought in G. Robert Blakey to cover up the investigation, to close down the investigation, to cover up the facts. We don't want G. Robert Blakey. It's true. We have to watch this thing very, very carefully. We have to have our own candidates, and we have to make sure some of this is done in a public way. But above all, it's done by someone who we trust. I trust Sprague. There aren't too many other lawyers who are acquainted with this material who I do trust, but you're quite right. It can be lost even if a special prosecutor is appointed if it's not a person of integrity, but we have to insist on that as well.
Well, it's a matter of power because, raw, naked power, because at the time of the House Select Committee in the 70s, even the liberal Congress people were cowed. And
especially the liberal Congress people were cowed.
Especially?
I think so. I think that's the big problem. I think we have to understand who the liberals are and what they've done and how liberals. I've always found the biggest problem we have had on the Kennedy assassination is with liberals. It was the nation which refused to touch this. It's the nation now which has run a meeting at Town Hall. First of all, they're running articles saying, in essence, endorsing the Warren Commission finally, now that they've taken a position. Further than that, they have a meeting at Town Hall. They invited me to speak. Oliver Stone was invited. Oliver Stone said, I'm not going to come if Mark Lane is there. So the nation, in true McCarthyite fashion, said, okay, Mr. Stone, you can establish a blacklist. We will not let Mark Lane speak. Then we have, in these times, leading the campaign to prevent an investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy. And the only abuse I have personally had since November of 1991, since I've been discussing this book, has come on 2 Pacifica radio programs, and these are the liberals, and this is a problem, and something has to be done about this. We have to understand that what we are talking about are not parochial concerns. They blew off the head of the President of the United States. We elected him, whether he was good, bad, or indifferent. I know there was no Camelot, but it doesn't make a difference. We elected the President. If the people in Langley, Virginia, can blow off the head of the president, we have to understand that the experiment we go through every 4 years, where we say this is a democracy, this is what makes us different from everybody else, or many other folks, because we have these elections. Those differences are a pretense if we allow the government to blow off the head of the president and we do nothing about it for 28 years. And in my view, and I have all the CIA documents saying, don't let Mark Lane talk about this when he gets on the air, radio or TV, talk about his politics. And I found that's what they did in the old days. Mark Lane is too far to the left. And now when we try again, we find people on the left, liberals, taking the advice of the Central Intelligence Agency and saying, Liberty Lobby is a right-wing organization, and Mark Lane's representing a right-wing organization. Let's talk about that instead of the death of the president. I'm sick to death of that, and I'm not doing that anymore. I will not be distracted by Central Intelligence Agency directives or anyone dumb enough to follow it inadvertently or purposefully. I will talk about the death of John F. Kennedy, and that's what I think the American people are interested in hearing about, and that's what I think we have to focus on and not be distracted from.
Well, I'm interested in this right-left reaction. Now, you've been on Ray Bream, who's on opposite this program,
yes,
who's sort of right, and he's
serious about this subject. I've been on that program more than once, and he has discussed the facts in this matter. Everybody remembers Bob Grant from out here. He's in New York. I've been on his show. He's got a major show in New York City, and he has had a thoroughly responsible discussion of the facts regarding John Kennedy. I just did Tom Snyder's show tonight, a network show, very responsible, focusing on these questions. The distractions have come from people in these times, Nation magazine, and some of the listeners, and a guy in Pacifica in San Francisco a couple of days ago.
KPFA.
Phil Madari. All he wants to talk about, why are you an apologist for Liberty Lobby? Because I represented them when they were charged with this. I wish Pacifica had published the story by Mr. Marchetti, and I wish Pacifica had been sued by E. Howard Hunt, and I would have represented Pacifica if they asked me. Pacifica didn't have the courage, or they wouldn't ask, or weren't asked. I don't know what happened, but it was Spotlight that did it, and I say, thank goodness somebody did it. Before that, back in 1964, it was the National Guardian, and I represented them, and I wrote my article, and they published the document, and then I was accused of being too far to the left. You know, an interesting thing, I've represented people all around this country, people charged with murder. No one has ever said to me, how dare you represent someone charged with murder? But if you represent someone whose political views you are particularly intolerant of, then they say, how dare you represent someone, even in a defamation case, which has nothing to do with the politics of the organization, how dare you represent that organization? In any event, I've been dwelling on this too much myself, and I'd rather now talk about the facts surrounding the death of John Kennedy. That's the matter on the agenda.
It is walking in the footsteps, this situation walking in the footsteps of Clarence Darrow, who, despite what they've said about Clarence Thomas, Clarence Darrow was one of the great legal minds of the 20th century, and he was put in the position of being hated by everybody in America for representing rich killers.
Yeah, well, that's true.
So,
Leopold and Loeb, but I'm not representing rich killers. I'm representing the right of a publication to print the truth and not be put out of business by the Central Intelligence Agency because it proves in publications that the CIA killed John Kennedy. And we have a responsibility, I think, to see to it that when that statement is made, no matter who makes it, when the truth is presented regarding the death of John Kennedy, that the truth has been given an opportunity to get a fair chance in court, and that's what I did. There is no case, there are very few cases that I've taken over the years that have given me more joy and satisfaction than winning the case against E. Howard Hunt. A little while ago, I represented a man named James Richardson, who had been charged with murdering his 7 children in Florida. I don't remember anybody saying, how dare you represent a murderer. Actually, we won the case, and the man had been in prison for 21 years, and we proved to the state that he'd been falsely in prison, and he was released. But prior to the time that happened, I don't recall anybody saying to me, how dare you represent a man who killed his children. Actually, he hadn't killed the children, but the charge had been made against him. And I think it's time now that we began to focus again, as everyone else in the country is, We have, on the questions of the death of John Kennedy, we have, for example, Time and CNN do a survey. It shows that 75% of the American people believe there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. We have evidence now, according to them, that half of the American people believe the CIA killed President Kennedy. This is a remarkable situation when this number of Americans, 1 out of 2 Americans, believe our own police organization killed our president. This provides an opportunity for us to work politically, mobilize folks who take that position, make it clear that this position has to be brought to bear on every candidate for the presidency and for every office. We need pledges as to what's going to be done about this. This gives us grounds to mobilize together, not against each other, but to mobilize together to see to it that something is done with this really remarkable political situation that some of us have worked for 28 years now to bring about.
Okay, well, this is 1992. We have a diminishing armload of presidential candidates running against George Bush. And George Bush, did you discuss in your book, as a matter of fact, toward the end, and his connections to the CIA in the early 1960s.
Yeah, because when he was appointed director in 1976, in essence, he said to the Senate under oath, "Read my lips, I never worked for the CIA before this moment," but the evidence shows that he was working for the CIA back in 1963. So says a memorandum by J. Edgar Hoover dated November 29th, 1963, saying that Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency was briefed by the FBI, Mr. Forsyth, the day after the Kennedy assassination about the Kennedy assassination. Now, we're not talking about some secretary lying about his or her resume, about some small thing about how many words he can type a minute. We're talking about the resume of a man who became president of the United States, a man who apparently has been in deep cover in covert intelligence work for many, many years and never has revealed that to the American people. I'm a hell of a lot more concerned about that than I am about what Gary Hart does with his knights.
But that was brought out that was George William Bush, not George Herbert Walker Bush.
Well, that's what the CIA said. That George William Bush said, I worked for the Social Security Administration most of the time. I was, for 6 months, an employee of the CIA doing low-level file work, filing some photographs. I was never briefed by Mr. Forsyth. I was never briefed about the Kennedy assassination. I was never briefed with the Defense Intelligence Agency in an interdepartmental briefing. It was absolutely not me. That leaves George Herbert Walker Bush. But there's more about Mr. Bush. Mr. Bush left New Haven, formed a company called Zapata. That was his lucky code name, Zapata Petroleum, in Midland, Texas. Sold his interest when they made a lot of money, millions. Opened a new company called Zapata Offshore Petroleum in Houston when he was married to Barbara. And they had helicopter pads all over Latin America, Colombia, the Far East. What they were doing is not quite clear, but it was Zapata Offshore Petroleum. Fletcher Prouty, who was Mr. X in JFK film, played by Donald Sutherland, who wrote the introduction to Plausible Denial as well. He was a colonel in the Air Force. He provided weapons of war for the CIA at the time. Was ordered by the CIA to provide 2 ships to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, and he provided them, got them from the naval facility, the Chesapeake Naval Facility near Washington, D.C. They were sent down to Elizabeth City, North Carolina, to what looked like at that time an abandoned naval base. The colors were painted off. And do you know the name of the top secret code name for the Bay of Pigs invasion at that time, known only to the Joint Chiefs and a few others? Operation Zapata. And the names of the 2 ships, Barbara and Houston, the only 2 ships which invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. Mr. Bush can say what he wants, but I think there's some evidence which has to be explained.
Yes. Who among the opposing presidential candidates is interested in this subject?
I don't think anybody's asked them yet, but I think it's time. I would think that Jerry Brown would be a candidate. I would like to think that Buchanan would raise this question, but I think that Buchanan, who poses as an enemy of the establishment, is a lot more part of the establishment, perhaps. But I hope I'm wrong about that, and maybe he will raise this question as well. But I think what we have to do is ask them all, raise this question, take the pledge. If I'm elected, I will appoint a special prosecutor. It'll be Richard Sprague or someone like that, and that the evidence will finally be presented to a jury. This is the rule of law. That's how our country functions. That's how Watergate was broken. They took these guys like Hunt and threw them up against the wall, literally or figuratively, and said, tell the truth or you go to jail. And they told the truth, and that's how it was broken. That's how Iran-Contra was broken. Judge Walsh came in, not congressional hearings and not lectures and not talks, but Judge Walsh came in, was a special prosecutor, and people confessed, and others were indicted, and people were convicted. Not enough, and they didn't go to jail long enough, but at least we got some of the truth as a result of the special prosecutor being appointed. That's the way the law is supposed to work in the country. What has the government done about the death of John Kennedy? Nobody even has been given a ticket for murdering John Kennedy. The government has been silent. And Mr. Bush, in commenting upon the deep feeling in this country, in which 3/4 of the people of this nation say they are convinced it was a conspiracy, in which 99% of the American people say we want all the files released, we want something done, Bush says, well, listen, some people think Elvis Presley is still alive. You can't trivialize our deep concerns, Mr. Bush, and you can't joke about the death of your predecessor. It's worse than just in bad taste, but more than that. He went on to say, and when I was director of the CIA, I was so confident that the Warren Commission was correct that I never looked at any CIA files about the death of John Kennedy. That is a bald-faced lie under the Freedom of Information Act. I have documents which go back to 1976 when Bush was director of the CIA, in which Bush ordered studies made of the vulnerability of the CIA regarding the death of John Kennedy in various areas. He ordered the studies himself. He looked at the files and he ordered the studies, and it's about time someone called him to account for lying to us. It wasn't just about taxes, lying to us about really important matters, which still are on the agenda for America.
Now, it's news to a lot of people, and somewhat disappointing that there seems to be a disagreement between you and Oliver Stone, because while Oliver Stone was in knee pants at the time of the assassination and you were writing the book, the fact that he brought a movie out and then the movie was a success galvanized public interest in this subject at this particular time.
I salute Oliver Stone for helping to put this matter on the agenda. I think it was indecent of him to mix fact and fiction so that people going to that film who are not scholars in the area come out and don't know what's true and don't know what's not true. I was Jim Garrison's advisor during the entire investigation of David Ferrie, Clay Shaw, and during the entire Clay Shaw trial. Jim Garrison's a very dear friend of mine. When I was married a few years ago, we went down to the chambers of the Court of Appeals, Jim Garrison's chambers in New Orleans, and my wife and I were married by Jim Garrison. He was the only person who's not a member of our family who was at our wedding dinner at Antoine's. I'm very close to Jim Garrison. But it is not appropriate to try to make Garrison bigger than life by proving to the American people in that film that Clay Shaw was guilty after Clay Shaw was acquitted and then died, and it is indecent to try to prove that he was guilty by lying to the people about what the record is. Let me give you an example of the worst thing in that film from my viewpoint. Those who saw the film will never forget, I think, the sea change scene when the actor playing David Ferrie has a nervous breakdown in the Fontainebleau Hotel and says, I killed him, I plotted it, and Clay Shaw plotted with me. And if that's not enough, Oliver Stone gives us flashbacks where you see the actors actually plotting it, so now you know they really plotted it. It's all made up. It's all made up. And the film is ostensibly based upon Jim Garrison's book. Read it. On the Trail of the Assassins, he says, I called in David Ferrie, Jim Garrison says. We questioned him. He denied any complicity. Then he called the office, but we decided to let him sweat it out because we realized he was deteriorating. We're going to give him a couple of weeks and then call him in, but he died and we never talked to him again. So when you make up a scene where the man confesses, implicates Clay Shaw, and then you go to the trouble of having flashbacks where you can actually see the people plotting and it's all a lie, it's a disservice to truth. And Mr. Stone excuses us by saying that, modestly stating that he, like Shakespeare, has fictionalized history a bit. Well, it's true. Shakespeare fictionalized history more than a bit, but everyone knew what the historical record was and that Shakespeare was utilizing that for his plays. These issues were then not in doubt. They were settled. Who killed John Kennedy? The role of the United States government in that murder is still a question in doubt. Nothing's been resolved yet, although there's a lot of evidence on that. And you cannot take an issue which is in controversy and make up evidence and commingle it with real evidence in an effort to confuse people, just so that in the Hollywood style, the bad guys have the black hats and the good guys have the white hats and everything is oversimplified. That's what Mr. Stone did. I salute him for putting the matter on the agenda, but I do think he has to be criticized for mixing fact and fiction in such even using black and white on occasion, new scenes to make it look like old scenes. I almost forgive having Fletcher Prouty, Mr. X, come in and give advice to Jim Garrison during the trial in 1968, when actually Prouty and Garrison met for the first time in 1989, and he never gave him the advice. I almost can forgive that. It's a little difficult, I think, to deal with some of the ludicrous aspects of the film. Donald Sutherland, as Mr. X says to Jim Garrison, played by Costner, I can't tell you who I am. This has to be secret, but call me Mr. X. And then gives enough background information so you can look him up in the phone book about how he was sent down to the South Pole by General Lansdale and all this background. You knew who he was in a minute if you looked into this matter at all. Those ludicrous touches, of course, nobody got who wasn't familiar with the facts or had no logical understanding of what was taking place. But I cannot forgive what Stone did to Clay Shaw, who may well have been guilty, but who, in my view, must be respected as someone who was acquitted by a jury. Now, I uncovered evidence, and it's in Plausible denial, which Garrison never had. I took a deposition of Richard Helms. Remember, at the time of the trial, Clay Shaw denied he ever worked for the CIA. I asked Richard Helms, who was the director of the CIA at the time, who was Clay Shaw? And he said, he worked for us. He was a contract agent. I told Jim Garrison at once. I called him. This was years after the trial, after Shaw had been acquitted. I told that to Jim, and Jim said if I had that at the time, I think we would have gotten a conviction, maybe. But when you indict somebody, you're a district attorney. Nobody forces you to indict anyone. When you indict somebody, you should do it because you have the evidence which you think is going to convict the person. Otherwise, you don't do it. He had the evidence which he thought he was going to rely upon. It was a long trial. The jury was only out for 50 minutes. They found Shaw guilty. Accept it. It's the jury system. Jury system.
They found Shaw not guilty.
I'm sorry, found Shaw. I'm sorry. Right. They found Shaw not guilty, and we have to accept that because that's how the system works. Our country is based to a very large extent upon the jury system. We came here from England and established a jury system where the representatives of the people judge the people and stand as a bulwark between the people who are accused and the tyranny of the crown. That's how our system began, and that's the very best part of the system that we have. If I had a religion, it would be the jury system. I believe in it, and I don't like to see it desecrated by Mr. Stone or anyone else in an effort to make an exciting, dramatic film. It didn't have to be done.
But in the case of the Shaw trial, the jury had agreed that there was a conspiracy to kill the president, but the only reason they...
I know that because I'm the one who polled the jury. I interviewed all the members of the jury, and I published that. That's correct, but they said they saw no evidence which linked Shaw to the CIA and no evidence which linked Shaw to the Kennedy assassination.
So then the evidence comes out later that Shaw was CIA.
And maybe that might have persuaded them, and maybe not. We don't know because we weren't in the jury, and it has to be presented to the jury. All of the evidence that you have has to be presented to the jury, and they utilize it the way they want. I've interviewed so many jurors over the last 41 years, and the dynamics of what takes place in a jury room when a jury is deliberating is very, very complicated, and you cannot really duplicate in any one case what took place in a previous case. I don't know what would have happened. Certainly would have been really useful in the case of the prosecution to have that evidence presented to the jury, especially since Shaw was denying it, and now you see evidence that he was involved. It might have made a difference with the jury, but...
it's unfair to speculate under you're a strict constitutionalist or a strict structuralist when it comes to the courts, and
Well,
so Clayshaw was innocent. He was found innocent, and
Well, see, if Stone had said what I just said in the film, if he said the man was found not guilty, but later evidence was developed, which showed that he actually worked for the CIA and that was never presented to the jury, that's one thing. He can do that. But to make up evidence, to have David Ferry lie about him, say things that he never actually said in real life. Say, yeah, Shaw did it, I did it, and have flashbacks demonstrating them doing it. It's inexcusable and it's indecent as far as I'm concerned.
Steve Jaffe, you're a photo analyst?
Yeah, I was with the Garrison office.
The photo evidence has become so confusing now with the Robert Groden, David Lifton, the X-rays, the phony X-rays, the autopsy photos, the phony autopsy photos. It's become so confusing. Have you been working in this area?
Well, not now. I was when Garrison was conducting his investigation. But I don't think it's confusing. I think it's very clear that there was a government cover-up and that you had to have people at the highest levels creating incriminating photographic evidence, such as the famous life cover photo that was published that was supposed to be Lee Harvey Oswald, and the caption on the cover was Lee Harvey Oswald with the weapons he used to kill President Kennedy and Officer Tippit, and that was published on February 21st, 1964, 18 days after the Warren Commission started their investigation. Mark Lane brought the evidence of the fabrication of those photographs up and presented that to the Warren Commission, and they rejected any concept that those were phony photographs, and now we know that to be true.
And recently they found the matting, the actual working copy of the cutout of the figure in the Dallas police file.
That's true.
Plus three photographs that were taken of ostensibly Oswald in poses, in that pose.
There actually
some
have
with
been
cleft
four.
chin, some with straight chin, some with cleft chin.
Well, that's the photograph that you're talking about was fabricated by joining a photograph of Oswald's face with a photograph of someone else's body in the backyard of Neely Street where he had lived at the chin. And if the technology that was used recently in, for example, John Barber's made a documentary called The Garrison Tapes, and he utilized the modern technology of the editing rooms to prove that you could not take the photographs that were found, and that if you did take the photographs that were found and superimpose the face of the first one over the other one, that they were identical. And so we know that they were fabrication, and Mark Lane raised that before the commission back in 1964.
But it's gotten so confusing with the publication of phony autopsy photos and rematted X-rays, and the X-rays not matching the autopsy photos, and the question of what's real and what's not. The Warren Commission at least had the opportunity to work from artist conceptions of photographs.
Well, why not? Why didn't they look at the photographs?
Well, we
Yeah.
wouldn't
That's the first
expect them to
question.
do that.
That's
They
right.
didn't
That's-
even look at the Zapruder film.
They're not
No.
doctors.
That's right. They're art critics.
Art critics.
Yeah.
Well, okay, we are on the air live as of March 11th, 1992, with Mark Lane and Steve Jaffe. Mark Lane's latest book, Plausible Denial, was the CIA involved in the assassination of JFK, and it reads like a novel, and a little bit of law lesson, and a lot of history, and a lot of under oath evidence that should have been blazing in the headlines a few years ago, but instead has been kept pretty much under wraps. Plausible Denial. And if you'd like to talk with Mark Lane and give him either the Pacifica treatment or the a proper gentlemanly conservative treatment.
Or show some concern for the facts about the death of President Kennedy. That's what I'd like to discuss.
Hello.
Oh, good morning, Roy. It's Peter in San Diego.
Hi, Peter.
Hi. Mark, I spoke to you about 8 hours ago on the Tom Leykis show, and I was able to mention briefly that I had read Rust to Judgment in 1966, and it was an enormously influential experience. In fact, as a high school student, when I read it in the fall of '66, I felt oddly empowered by having this information and insight, and I must say that it has gotten me on helped to get me on a very different track for the rest of my life, and I just wanted to let you know that I, and I'm sure many others out there, really appreciate the consistent work you've done on this issue over the years. I had a question for you, but first I just wanted to share briefly some information that I've come across about Dan Rather's role in this. I know many of the assassination researchers referred to his on-air description of the Zapruder film shortly after the assassination, which was many years before the general public had access to actually seeing the film. And I was able to get a question to Dan Rather on February 4th this year, the day that the 48 Hours program on the assassination aired that evening. And that afternoon he was doing some live phone interviews, and he did one here in San Diego on the CBS affiliate. And I was able to ask him about how he could have described the film thusly in contradiction apparently to what it shows. And I just want to share with you briefly how he answered this and to get your perspective on it.
What did he say?
Well, he said that he tried to put it into a context of having seen the film only once, shortly after the assassination, and not as a journalist so much, but as one who was invited in to screen it to evaluate its potential for possible sale to CBS. In other words, the people who owned the film or controlled it were showing it around and were trying to sell it to the highest bidder. And he said on the air on February 4th this year that after seeing it once in a darkened screening room, he ran out. He wasn't so much interested in its potential, but he ran back to the studio and went on the air and tried to describe it as best he could recollect it. Now, in saying that, it appeared to me that he was trying to distance himself from his obviously inaccurate or flawed description. However, he went on in this interview on February 4th to say that he did describe what he had seen. He said that to this day, the film shows JFK being pushed forward, and rather added on February 4th this year that, in fact, the film shows that the shots came from the rear, which is exactly what happened. So it was obviously a very convoluted, confusing explanation that he still has. And if you're interested in this kind of footnote to the history of the media coverage of this, I'd be happy to send you a copy of the audio tape or a transcript if you want to give a mailing address later. But
I'll give you now. It's Mark Lane, 105 2nd Street Northeast, Washington, D.C. The zip is 20002. So I'd be appreciative if you would send me that.
Okay, I'd be happy to. By the way, I've, just as an aside here, briefly, I've interviewed Dick Gregory many times over the years, and he's always spoken very highly of you, which is also confirms the feeling I had about you, and I certainly enjoyed Plausible Denial. The question I guess I would get to here coming out of this Dan Rather discussion is, I've tried to pay very close attention to the mainstream media reportage on the JFK film and on the assassination during the past 3 months since Stone's film came out, and I've got, I guess, hundreds of hours on videotape by now of many of the programs, network, syndicated, and local, that have touched on this since December 20th. And I would like to get your opinion or your evaluation of the mainstream media's coverage in this last 3 months, and if you see it as very much different, aside from the quantity that's occurred, very much different in quality than what came in the 20 or 30 years before.
Well, it began with George Lardner Jr. in the Washington Post doing a piece called Dallas in Wonderland. All of a sudden, Mr. Lardner, the intelligence writer for the Washington Post became a film critic. His first film review, he didn't wait till the film was out. He didn't even wait till I finished shooting the film. Anyone who knows anything about films knows that editing is where it all happens. You can shoot an awful lot of stuff, but what you do with the editing is what results in the film, and you can't review a film till it's been screened. But it was an effort by Lardner, obviously, to destroy the film and to ridicule Stone and to frighten Stone, who was utilizing, this is another problem with the film, I think, and that is that Stone backed down. I was down there in New Orleans. Jim Garrison said, first time he said it, I remember he came out of the DA's office there in Tulane, and I was standing along by his side when he spoke in the corridor of the courthouse there where his office was. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the news media, I have some bad news for you. Your Central Intelligence Agency killed your president." I heard him say that 1,000 times, not only to the news media. I heard him say it to the assistant DAs. I heard him say it to the investigators. We have to get more evidence to prove that. That's all he said over and over and over. The original screenplay that Stone had Garrison saying the CIA killed President Kennedy. Then came the attacks led by George Lardner. Let me just say that George Lardner has said, if Mark Lane ever says that I'm a paid agent of the CIA, I will sue him for defamation, and I want to make it plain right now, I've never said that George Lardner was paid by the CIA. If he has not been paid by the CIA, he should raise this with his union representative because, as Otello said, he's done the state some service, and they know it. But he led the campaign, and it got to the point where finally Time magazine picked up Lardner's comments in the Washington Post and gave a full page to the attack on Stone. This caught Stone's attention. Time Warner are the distributors of the film, JFK. He knew exactly what was being said, and then the film was rewritten. Who did the film say did it? The military-industrial complex. We have to indict that guy. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, Lyndon Johnson, CIA. Stone himself said in Life magazine, I believe it was Army intelligence that did it. Who cares what he believes? It's supposed to be the Jim Garrison story. I mean, Oliver Stone should not have made his third Vietnam film. He should have made his first Kennedy assassination film. And it was about Jim Garrison. It was a Jim Garrison story. Jim Garrison said the CIA did it. It's unfortunate that the film did not say as clearly as Jim Garrison had said who he thought was culpable. But that was the campaign. It was remarkable in its viciousness. It, I think, forced Mr. Stone to back down and retreat from what his original firm position had been in presenting what Jim Garrison had said.
That's interesting. I know I've noticed, too, the influential role the New York Times has played even before the film came out. I think the Sunday before, Tom Wicker had an endless article in the Sunday New York Times attacking Stone and the film, and of the 40 or so articles, op-ed pieces, columns, etc., almost all of them in the New York Times that have appeared in the last 3 months have been negative. And of course, the networks, national TV networks, take a lot of their cues from the New York Times. But yet I've been encouraged that a lot of the coverage I've seen has been neutral or even positive about the film, and I think it's really something to be optimistic about. But certainly appreciate your work, and it's a pleasure.
Are you in San Diego?
Hello?
Are you in San Diego?
Yes, are you coming down here?
Yeah, tomorrow. I'm going to be on the Mark Larson show at 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock, and then I'm going to be at, you know where Warwick's bookstore is?
Yeah.
La Jolla? I'll be there at 7:30 to 9.
I will try to come by.
Terrific. See you then. Maybe.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.
It's Peter Chowka. I would hate to have his video cassette bill. It's like he's got 8 million hours of the Gulf War and 30 million hours of Bush and 60 million hours. Now, I saw a rebroadcast of a series called The Trial of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Oh, and yes.
Vincent
Bugliosi
versus Spence.
Yeah, right.
And Bugliosi took the Zapruder film and he demonstrated that the shot must have come from the back because the brain spurting was coming out the front.
You're right. I mean, are we going to discuss whether the world's flat or round? I mean, everybody knows when you look at the Zapruder film, it shows that the bullet hit the president from the front. His head was driven backwards suddenly and violently. Now they're talking about a neuromuscular response. Just reverse this for a minute. Let's just say that the government said that when the head was driven backwards suddenly and violently, the president was driven back into the seat and bounced off of the seat. That Bobby Hargis, the motorcycle policeman to the left rear, testified he was splattered with blood and brain material. Such an impact it almost knocked him off his motorbike. That Jackie is reaching back there for the brain, apparently, on the back of the car. Just say that we then said, nope, that shot came from the back, and all of these things are neuromuscular responses, etc. They'd lock us up in a mental institution. I mean, if we tried to present that position, it's just an absolute absurdity. Nothing upsets me much more than seeing lawyers who are supposed to be reputable participate in what they keep on referring to as the trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. The man was dead before the trial began. There was no trial. Nobody was under oath. No one was subjected to the penalty of perjury. It was a farce. It was a mock trial, which was a mockery. And it is an outrage that lawyers would participate in that and call that a trial and say, therefore, we've reached a certain conclusion. Every element which makes a trial in America, that when you testify, you can go to jail if you lie. That's the point. That a jury is chosen to be impartial. That the defendant plays a major part. He talks to his lawyer. He tells him what his position is. You don't try people after their death when they've been denied a right to talk to the lawyer. What you do is you try the FBI and you try the people who are alive who conspired to deny Lee Harvey Oswald his rights, and you try the people who killed John F. Kennedy. You don't try someone after his death in what is not a trial but a mockery.
Which is pretty much what happened and recounted in the book Plausible Denial. Hello?
Hello. How you doing?
We're doing terrific.
Mark Lane, how are you?
Terrific. How you doing?
I'm pretty good. My name's Jim.
Okay, Jim.
I've been listening this evening, and I understand your feeling with reference to Mr. Stone's movie. I was 13 when John Kennedy got assassinated, and it really struck me very heavily because about a week prior to that, ABC had a radio program called Flair Reports. And if you remember, Adlai Stevenson had been to Dallas, was spat on and hit over the head with a sign. And the only reason I go back is because there were some problems in Texas at that point. And Adlai Stevenson, being a Democrat and being treated that way, I was on the way out the back door of the house. And at the end of this little program, it said, next week, the eyes of Dallas will be on the president, and the eyes of the world will be on Dallas. And I said, he's not going to make it out of Dallas. Anyway, needless to say, he didn't. Stone has been able to do with this movie something that, despite your book and Garrison's efforts, and a lot of other diligent people looking into this case have not been able to do, is galvanize public opinion to the point that at least people are seriously saying, wait a minute, we want to know what really happened. I understand your feeling with reference towards the jury system, and I agree with you. However, there's a whole generation of young people, who are a lot younger than both of us, who didn't know about it. And even to this day, I mean, I deal with kids continuously, teenagers who don't even know who John Kennedy was, except he was a president. They don't even know what's happened, and it hurts. It really hurts to realize that from 64 until 68, we lost John Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy. I'm not saying that I like George Wallace because I'm a black man, but George got his brains, or got shot, okay? I don't know what was going on.
George Lincoln Rockwell.
Those are the only ones I can think of at this point, right off the tip of my head. But I don't know what was happening with us as a nation at that point. But it's really freaky. It's frightening when I look back on it. Then I see the usurpation of the Constitution via Richard Nixon and his resignation, and prior to his resignation...
Hey, would you make it a little faster, please? We have 11 calls coming in.
They got Agnew out. I mean, the whole thing, yeah, there probably was a plot, no doubt about it. I'm saying this very simply. What can we do to change it?
What we have to do we have to get millions and millions of signatures in this country on petitions demanding that a special prosecutor be appointed. The fact is we can do anything. We ended the war in Vietnam. The government did not end it, and the news media did not end it. It was Walter Cronkite giving us the body count every night, and Lyndon Johnson seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. The fact is the American people ended the war. We can do anything that we have our mind to do. There's a political awareness now regarding the death of John Kennedy, which makes it possible to organize, and we have to do what we did a long time ago all over again. We have to get people in action all over this country, millions of signatures on petitions, demonstrations, put this in the political process, make sure that the presidential candidates and congressional candidates and candidates for the Senate all take a position on this question. That's the thing we can start to do. The next edition of Plausible Denial, and in fact, Rush to Judgment will be coming out again in 2 weeks in a new edition, first one since 1975. And we'll have a new introduction. Part of the introduction will be Fact or Fiction, a moviegoer's guide to Oliver Stone's JFK, so you can tell what's fact and what's fiction. But both of these books will have on the last page a petition to the United States government demanding that a special prosecutor be appointed. And it has a post office box in terms of where to send the material. That we have to start organizing politically around this issue.
Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my call. I have a question about Kerry Thornley.
Okay.
I'd like to know, is it a coincidence that Kerry Thornley was in the Marines with Oswald in Asia as well as in New Orleans?
I don't know. There have been a lot of questions raised about that. Jim Garrison looked into that at one time, thought that Kerry Thornley was the person acting as a double for Lee Harvey Oswald. I'm not sure that any of that has ever been resolved, but there have been questions asked.
He was on Inside Edition or Geraldo or something recently and talked about it and said that he was that Oswald was the voice of reason compared to how much he hated Kennedy. And it just seemed very strange. Was he at Atsugi?
That's what he said. He was on Now It Can Be Told with Geraldo Rivera.
Right.
And he said he'd written a book about Lee Harvey Oswald and that he'd been in the Marine Corps with him. But as Mark said, nothing was resolved during the investigation or by that program.
I also thought the trial of Lee Harvey Oswald was pretty much a sham. The only interesting thing to me was getting to see Ruth Payne, and I wonder also why she was not named in the JFK Oliver Stone film. They had her character in there.
Well, he didn't name a lot of people who he thought might sue him for defamation, and I guess that's probably why he didn't do it. If he couldn't get a release, he didn't name him because he could say that Clay Shaw was guilty because Clay Shaw, being dead, has no rights. In other words, you can...
And other people must have signed some sort of waiver.
If they were alive, the ones that are dead, you can say anything about. They can't do anything about it.
What do you think about George de Mohrenschildt? Is there some accurate connection with the intelligence community?
Oh, yeah. George de Mohrenschildt was a spy for a lot of different people over the years. He was a quite remarkable man. They picked him up for, they thought he was attempting to assassinate Marshal Tito. He went into Guatemala. He went into the impenetrable jungles of Guatemala. He and his wife, he said, and they emerged on the very day that the Bay of Pigs troops left Guatemala City. He arrived in Guatemala City. He worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. He was the baby.
He must have known E. Howard Hunt, certainly, in those days.
Well, I presume he probably did, but in any event, he was the babysitter for Lee Harvey Oswald for the CIA. And he was about to be called as a witness before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and he died the day before he was supposed to call. I went down there for the coroner's inquest. It was quite interesting because the district attorney... What happened was this. DeMarshall was staying at a home where his daughter lived. His daughter was staying with a very wealthy woman in Florida. And this woman, it's kind of like a Columbo movie, and this is before the days when people had videotape recorders. She went out, this woman, to play a bridge tournament. But she wanted to have a record made of some soap opera. So she said to her domestic worker, here's an audio tape recorder, just put it on and record the sound of this television soap opera. And so the tape recorder was playing, and then you hear the bullet, the shotgun explode, the shot that killed George DeMarshall. They claimed he committed suicide. But if you listen to the tape, you hear this. You hear a little noise, and you hear silence, and then you hear beep, 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 a little more noise, and then you hear the shot. The beep, 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 beep was a security system on medium mode. One mode is if it's on fully armed, if anyone opens a door or window, a siren goes off and the police are notified. On another mode, it's off entirely. But on the medium mode, it goes beep, 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 beep to show that someone has opened the door and come into the house.
God.
Just before DeMarshall was shot, that's what happened. And I talked to the district attorney when I listened to that tape. I was down there just before the coroner's inquest, and I said, does that sound like someone came in the house? He said, we're not going to go into that. And I said, why? I said, you understand why? This is bigger than all of us. We have to do what we have to do. I said, I don't understand that. And he said, well, listen, you can't speak at the coroner's inquest. You're just going to be a spectator. I said, I know that. And so he played the tape and told the coroner's jury, a cross-section of the folks in the area, that this was a suicide, et cetera. And this woman on the coroner's jury said, that beep, 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 that sounds like my security system. That means somebody apparently went into the house. He said, we're not going into that. And so they ruled that it was a suicide, and that was the end of that. But I think there's some very serious questions as to whether he was murdered.
Okay, thanks for your call.
Sorry.
It may have been a coincidence that maybe there was a burglar and a suicide at the same time.
It may have been a lone nut.
I might add, by the way, Dallas in Wonderland is a book also written in 1967, I believe, by Paul Dallas, who was a manager of KPFK.
Is that right?
And it was a story of his adventures as manager here. So that's the original Dallas in Wonderland. Lewis Carroll, not disregarding him. Yeah. Hello?
Yes, Mark, how are you? I
Fine,
had the
thank you.
pleasure of meeting you at the Beverly Center about 3 months ago or so,
Uh-huh.
and you signed my book and everything, and my record album. Before I comment,
You have an album?
Pardon me?
He has an album?
Well, no, that Controversy album that came out about 25 years ago. Anyway,
Lawrence Schiller did that.
I want to recommend,
Right,
first of all...
let me just say, is that the Columbia album with Lawrence Schiller?
Well, it's on Capitol, actually.
Capitol, that's
Yeah.
Pro.
Let me tell you a funny story about Lawrence Schiller. He went around posing as a person of integrity, and he went to a lot of different people, and he said, I'm really a critic of the Warren Commission. And he sold that album with a big picture of me. So in essence, it's my position. It was basically the Warren Commission's position. I'm on for a very short period of time, but the government's position is presented. He fooled everybody. He visited me at a home here in Beverly Hills in the area, Joe and Maggie Fields, and they had a big German Shepherd named Brondo. As I say, he fooled everybody. He did not fool everybody. He did not fool Brondo. Brondo was the only one who saw through his disguise and bit him in the buttocks, and he later wrote an article condemning the dog as being really vicious, but the dog was not vicious. He was a dog of absolute discretion.
Yeah, the album came out in 1967. It's called The Controversy.
Right.
It's on Capitol.
Yeah.
Anyway, I want to recommend the video called Plot to Kill, Rest to Judgment. If you can get it, it's worth watching. Of course, Mark made that. Well, Mark didn't make it, but he's in it.
Yeah, I was one of the two producers of it with Emile D'Antonio,
Yeah.
and it is true. It's me interviewing key witnesses, almost all of whom are dead now. Most of whom were never called by the Warren Commission, but they're all witnesses that people. The only witness of the murder of Officer Tippit, the the men on the railroad bridge and all of the key witnesses in the area. It's a historic record, and what's exciting about the film is you see these people from Texas and they're just telling the truth, and it's obvious, I think, to anyone watching that this is the truth. It's not Dan Rather making a little mistake because it was a darkened room. You always see film in a darkened room. What does it mean, a darkened room? But in any event, it was it's not the leadership talking. It's the American people speaking. That's why I find that such a moving
my comment is this.
Yeah.
I blame the Secret Service for letting the assassination happen. I mean, number one, there were at least 13 windows open on the book depository, and that should not be. Also, the Secret Service didn't react after the first shot. I mean, we all saw when Reagan got shot how fast they reacted. I mean, the drivers of Kennedy's car, didn't do a thing until it was too late. I mean, why didn't they take off? I mean,
they slowed down is what they
right.
did.
So, I mean, has anybody really? I've never heard a really heavy criticism on the Secret Service.
Well, yeah, a lot of us have criticized them. But remember, the windows open in the book depository building had little to do with the death of the president. He was shot from behind the wooden fence. In fact, I was in Dallas recently. I've been there. They've made the book depository building and the 6th floor a shrine, a monument.
I know. I was there, Mark.
Yeah, it's the only monument in America to a place where nothing happened. I mean, the grassy knoll is what should be the monument. That's where they killed him from, obviously. But obviously security was lax, and shots came from some windows someplace behind him, maybe the book depository building, although I don't think so.
Steve?
But some shots came from back there, and when the car moved forward, the shots from behind him compelled the Secret Service fellows to go forward, and when they went forward, they went right up to the murderer, the person who killed the president, was behind the wooden fence in the grassy knoll.
Steve?
Yeah.
Hi, it's good to talk to you.
Hi. Good.
In your opinion, the Oswald backyard photos, in your opinion, are they absolutely faked?
Yes.
With no doubt about it?
No doubt about it.
So I don't understand why, right there, that should be a major proof of a conspiracy. But to me, that's not talked about enough. There's a new video out now called Who Didn't Kill JFK, which came from a video called Fake. I'm sure you were aware of that.
Right.
By
Mr.
Jack
White
and Jim Mars. And I also recommend that one, too. But I don't think this is talked about enough. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think if there was a special prosecutor and the evidence, especially the photographic evidence, was included in the analysis of the investigation, that this would reveal that a very carefully planned line of incrimination began at least as far back as September of 1963, prior to the murder of President Kennedy.
I mean, there's no question. If these pictures were faked before November 22nd, 1963, you're quite right. What we have is evidence being established in order to prove Oswald was guilty of a crime which hadn't occurred yet. In Plausible Denial, we talk about and we document the fact that the CIA had set up an elaborate charade in Mexico City implicating Lee Harvey Oswald and leaving behind a trail which would lead to him after the assassination, and it was without question related to what the CIA knew was going to happen. They were setting up the trail. They knew in September, end of September, the first few days of October, that they were going to kill John Kennedy in November. Let me just make a comment about something which a lot of folks haven't heard too much about. Do you know about this article by Arthur Kroc? Younger people are saying, who's Arthur Kroc? Arthur Kroc was the single most respected journalist in America in the 1960s. He wrote on the editorial page of the New York Times. He was very close to the Kennedys. In fact, Joseph Kennedy, John Kennedy's father's first book was ghostwritten by Arthur Kroc. And young John Kennedy, when he was a young man and worked on his thesis, Why England Slept, he wrote it in Arthur Kroc's Georgetown Library with the help of Arthur Kroc. And then Arthur Kroc had it turned into a book and got him a literary agent. That's how close he was. John Kennedy, when he wanted to speak to the American people, talked to Arthur Kroc, and Arthur Kroc would publish material. This is October 3rd, 1963, editorial page of the New York Times, Arthur Kroc's column called The Intra-Administration War in Vietnam. And Arthur Kroc is saying John Kennedy has declared war on the Central Intelligence Agency, and John Kennedy wants the American people to know there are some very serious problems. And then he goes on to say, twice, according to a high United States source, twice the CIA flatly refused to carry out instructions from Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, that was Kennedy's ambassador to Vietnam. And in one instance, frustrated a plan of action Mr. Lodge brought from Washington, from John Kennedy, because the agency disagreed with it. You like that? The CIA disagreed with it. They don't do what the president says. Then it goes on. Listen to this. The CIA's growth was likened to a malignancy, which the very high official was not sure even the White House could control any longer. And listen to this. If the United States ever experiences an attempt at a coup to overthrow the government, it will come from the CIA. That's John Kennedy talking to the American people in October. The next month they blew his head off. And there's the Warren Commission, and they don't ask Arthur Kroc, where'd you get this information that John Kennedy was talking, or someone on his behalf was talking, to you about the CIA being possibly involved in a coup. If there was a coup, it would come from the CIA. I confronted Bert Griffin, who was one of the lawyers for the Warren Commission, with this column. He'd never heard of it. It was in a program in Cleveland. We were on a television show together. And I said, what about this? He'd never heard of it. And I said, well, how could you not know about it? He said, I didn't know about it. I said, well, what was your... He said, well, my area basically was Jack Ruby. I said, okay. Did Ruby testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee? He said, not to my knowledge. I said, well, here's the exhibit. UAC release for Jack Ruby to testify. It's at the stationery of the Department of Justice. FBI, sworn to by a staff assistant. The 24th of November, 1947. And it says that Mr. Jack Rubenstein of Chicago, noted as a potential witness, should be not be called for open testimony. In the hearings, it should be closed testimony. You know why it had to be closed? Because he was an informant. This is what it said. He is providing information functions for the staff of Congressman, are you ready? Congressman Richard M. Nixon, Republican of California. Jack Ruby worked for Richard Nixon in 1947 and testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the lawyer for the Warren Commission in charge of Jack Ruby's background never heard about that until I showed it to him about 2 weeks ago.
Mark, did the FBI do any tests for nitrates on the leaves behind the grassy knoll just after the assassination? I mean, you would think they would, because people said the shots came from the grassy knoll. So I'm wondering, did the FBI do any tests on the leaves for nitrates?
No, but they never paid any attention to anything that anybody said about shots coming from back there. They never sought to indicate, to examine anything that anybody said, which was contrary to Oswald acted alone. The FBI said it does not fit in what we know the evidence to be. So there's no sense exploring it. That was their line.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Well, did I say this is KPFK Los Angeles, by the way? And we are on the air live with Mark Lane as of March 11th, 1992.
Thank you for appearing, Mr. Lane.
Thank you.
It's very valuable to have the opportunity to hear you make comments about the truth regarding not so much the JFK, but regarding the allegations that are made casting aspersions on you, and in fact, coincidentally, with Fletcher Prouty, guilt by assassination, in terms of
I really,
and I'm glad you can.
Yeah, let me just say, I want to comment just.
This is part of the reason why.
Hold on a
we
second.
can't get together, okay?
Okay, I'm glad you raised the question of Fletcher Prouty. Fletcher Prouty is a good and decent man, and there have been such vicious attacks. There have been vicious attacks upon him primarily in these times, which are absolutely unprincipled. Anyone who's listening, who subscribes from these times, I would just like you to write to those folks and tell them to cut it out. You'll cancel your subscription. He's a very decent man. He doesn't really have. I mean, I've known him for a while. He was on our Citizens Commission of Inquiry in 1975 when we tried to get the Congress to investigate the Kennedy and King assassinations, and he has done very serious and brave work, and he's made facts known to us that we would never know because he was in a position to know things that most of us have never known. It is just and outraged that he's been subjected to these vicious attacks by in these times and others.
I agree totally. In fact, I think he's a national treasure myself, if only because he had such a truly remarkable career. I mean, he was at the right place at the right time, and now he's willing to speak about it. There's basically no one from that era who apparently is willing to talk about it. So there you go. But my question pertains in regards to, well, actually, it's not even regards to the topic. Once again, what I'd like to know is have more information specified regarding your evidence, if you have any real bona fide evidence to back up your statements regarding the efforts of the CIA to suppress or quiet either the potential publishers of the book or subsequent to that, any discussion about it in the media.
Yeah, I got a lot of documents, hundreds and hundreds of documents from the CIA under the Freedom of Information Act. I'll read a little part of one if you like.
Okay.
Now, this is what they say. We should employ propaganda assets, this is their own language, to answer and refute the attacks of the critics, Mark Lane and others. Book reviews and feature articles are particularly appropriate for this purpose. Then it says exactly what the book reviewers should say about us. But here it says feature articles are particularly appropriate to refute us. Do you know the longest article ever in its history until that time, initiated by the Associated Press, was an attack upon me and some of the other critics. Longest article they ever initiated. Just think of what happened while there was an AP. World War II began. World War II ended. Somebody stepped on the moon. A nuclear bomb was detonated. But the longest article they ever wrote was an attack upon me. And then it goes on to talk, these documents, it tells what should be it tells the reviewers and the critics what they should say about us. And then they talk about the need to utilize propaganda assets and elite contacts in the news media and elsewhere to prevent the circulation of the views of Mark Lane, to prevent the publication of his works in other countries, to utilize key assets in political circles in other countries for the purpose of silencing Mark Lane, etc. It goes on and on and on. And they, in fact, visited the publishers. We know that now. They visited the publishers and told them not to publish Rush to Judgment, and that's why almost every publisher in America declined to do it. Did they visit the publishers and tell them not to publish Plausible Denial? Check back in 5 years when we get our documents under the Freedom of Information Act, and we'll find out why every publisher in America except Thunder's Mouth Press refused to publish the work. But yeah, I have hundreds of pages of documents regarding the CIA and the FBI's efforts to prevent a circulation of views which are different from their own.
Okay, well, thank you very much. However, I've heard that there are efforts, or there has been very effective measures to prevent the FOIA from being an effective method to obtain further information on into the future. Would you agree with that? Thank you very much, Mike.
Yeah, I would agree with that. In fact, I was among those who brought the first actions under the Freedom of Information Act. It said, when it was amended after the Watergate debacle, it said that at that time, and still says, that you make your application and they have 10 days to answer. Well, that's how it began, and they started to obey those rules at the very beginning, but then they let it slip and slip and slip. The courts did not insist. And then when you filed an application thereafter, the FBI, the CIA would say, well, why do you think you might be in there? What have you done? Fill out these forms. Tell us what you've done to make you think that we have a file on you. In other words, if they didn't have a file on you, fill out the form. They'll
do-it-yourself file.
Yeah, do-it-yourself file. We'll develop one. Help us develop one for you. So, yeah, I mean, these things are only effective if there's an administration, if there are courts that have some understanding of the spirit of the law and want it to prevail, and that's not where we are now.
We have one comment about the grassy knoll. One of the proofs that is used to establish a shot from the grassy knoll is the witnessing of smoke from a rifle, and the response to that is that modern rifles don't smoke.
Yeah, well, okay. This question was raised by Joseph Ball, who I debated here, God, what year was that? At the Beverly Hills High School a long time ago. A.L. Weirin was there. And that's what Ball said. He was one of the lawyers for the Warren Commission. Modern rifles don't smoke. Well, first of all, this was not a modern rifle. This was a Mannlicher Carcano, was an ancient weapon. But this is what's interesting about that weapon. First of all, we don't even know what weapon was utilized for behind the wooden fence, but let's just deal with the only weapon that we know. The FBI had a witness who said he thought he saw a flash of light someplace in the book depository building. Well, that's enough. Let's see if the rifle gives off a flash of light. So J. Edgar Hoover had the weapon tested, as he said, in a fairly well-lit room, in a darkened room, and in a moderately dark room to see if a flash of light is given off. And Hoover's report is the FBI laboratory determined that no flash of light can be seen. Hoover added, however, it does give off puffs of white smoke when it's fired. That was Hoover's own report in terms of their investigation. So that weapon did give off smoke.
That's the one, the Mannlicher Carcano, the humanitarian rifle.
Yes, humanitarian rifle.
But if this was...
Well, it's not such a humanitarian rifle because the rifle Bible, the one which told all about the capability of his weapon, said it was actually a very dangerous weapon, but primarily to the person who was firing it because it had a nasty habit of blowing up in the face of the person who was pulling the trigger.
But if you had an agent on the grassy knoll firing a rifle, that would be likely to be a modern rifle, and then...
Yeah, well, different rifles give off smoke. When we catch the guy and we get the weapon, we'll test it and we'll see what it gives off. But it's possible that the Mannlicher Carcano was fired from behind that fence because they may want to plant a bullet from back there into the limousine or into a body in there. Someone was hit.
There's already too many bullets. I don't think that anybody wants to find any more bullets.
There are more bullets than there should be, actually. I mean, there's a bullet. Siebert and O'Neill, two FBI agents, were present at the autopsy. We have their report saying a bullet was removed from the president's body and given to them, and they left with it. Where is that bullet? Where is the president's brain? I mean, a lot of information, a lot of evidence is missing. And those who say, free the files, better be ready for the fact that some of the documents may be shredded and some new ones may be invented.
Wasn't there a recent death of one of the archive people?
I don't know. Is that true?
Bernard Finsterwald.
Oh, no, he was an archivist.
No, he wasn't an archivist, but he was working in Washington collecting documents on the Kennedy assassination.
People die. I mean, it's 28 years after the assassination. We would be really surprised if everybody was alive today was alive then. But that's not a suspicious death in my view.
Hello.
Yes, I'd like to ask about. Well, first of all, thank you for having this show. Wonderful, wonderful information. I wanted to ask something about Garrison. On a tape that I'd heard on this show, said something about a .45 bullet that was found near where the assassination took place, near a piece of the president's skull and brain were found lying on the street, somewhere to the side of where the motorcade had passed by, and how that had disappeared. It was in the possession of the Dallas Police Department, and it appeared to be a .45 slug. And I wanted to ask the gentleman, I think his name is Steve, Mr. Jaffe, about the film. It looks like William Greer turns around as he's slowing down. It's not so much turning around as he's doing something. Have you ever speculated as to? I know a lot of people have speculated, but have you ever yourself really studied that and come up with any determination as to what he was doing?
Yeah, I've studied the film over and over, and I've been with I was in Paris with the French intelligence agents who had studied the film in detail, and to my knowledge, it's very obvious that there is movement in the car, but there's nothing to contradict the fact that the shots came from the right front, and that the president was shot from the grassy knoll, and there were also shots fired from behind.
And that the driver's hands were at all times on the steering wheel, although his foot was on the brake.
I don't know where his hands were at all times, but there's nothing. I don't believe in that theory, and I don't think there's no need for speculation, because when you see the film, there's no way to mistake that he was shot from the right front and driven back, and it's not possible for a neuromuscular reaction by his neck to be humanly possible to drive him back at 104 miles an hour.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, anyways, what about what Jim Garrison had said about the .45 slug being found on the street?
Well, there is a photograph
of an officer reaching down and picking up something, and I don't think you can tell from the photograph exactly what it is, but it does look like a pretty sizable bullet that he's picking up. I think that's what Jim was making reference to. There was also a bullet which struck the curb, and there's a mark on the curb, and that was examined later, and that bullet didn't hit any of the occupants of the vehicle, but it shattered when it struck the concrete on the curb, and either part of the bullet or part of the concrete struck a man by the name of James Tague in the face, causing a minor injury, but so far as we know, the only other person injured that day in Dealey Plaza by firing, other than the president who was killed and Governor Connolly, who was very seriously wounded.
I think we were all injured that day. I was just only 4 years old, but I couldn't believe the amount of pain people were showing just for weeks afterwards. Everybody seemed completely stunned. I want to recommend a great film. It's fictional, of course, but it's called 7 Days in May. Have you ever seen it?
Yes, I know it. It's an interesting film.
Yeah, it's totally speculative, but it certainly seems to be based on something that could possibly have happened or hopefully will never happen in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Hello?
Well, hi. I'd like to ask Mark Lane a couple questions too. Referring to the caller who just hung up, he spoke about the driver taking a shot at President Kennedy. I just bought a book called Mortal Error.
Oh, yeah.
In which this book proclaims that accidentally one of the Secret Service men in the follow-up car leveled the rifle at Kennedy and shot him.
That's correct. That's correct. That's what he says. His name is Hickey. This is the most absurd position that has been presented, in my view, in the last 28 years. It almost makes the Warren Commission report look credible by comparison. In that, it's a book written by a guy named Menninger, who was 6 years old at the time, but he's based it entirely. I just say that to indicate that he has no personal knowledge. He bases this upon a statement made by a man named Donahue, who wrote a couple of articles in the Baltimore Sun in 1977. He was an analyst for CBS in trying to prove that the Warren report was correct. And Donnie was on a radio program. This ballistics guy was on a radio program in Washington, D.C., an ABC affiliate, I think it was. And I called and I talked to him. And I said, who was in the car, the follow-up car? And he started giving me the names of Mr. this one and Mr. Powers and Mr. O'Donnell. And I said, you know who they are? That's Kenny O'Donnell and David Powers, John Kennedy's two closest friends, two strongest advisors, and two of the most powerful men in America at the time. They both told Tip O'Neill, and he wrote about it in his book, A Man on the House, that they heard the shots and they came from behind the wooden fence on the grassy knoll. I said, Mr. Donahue, are you saying that the rifle was fired right behind them? It went between the left ear of one man and the right ear of the other man. This automatic weapon was exploded and they didn't hear it? He said, no, they heard it. I said, so they've lied? He said, yes. And I said, the Secret Service agent lied? He said, yes. And I said, everybody in Dealey Plaza, some people just a few feet from that car, saw this man fire by mistake and kill the president, and they ran right past the car up the grassy knoll toward the wooden fence looking for the assassins, and there he was all the time speeding away in the car. Is that correct? And he, in essence, said everybody was lying. And this is all based upon his analysis of extrapolation of where a bullet might have come from. It is the single most absurd book, I think, written on this subject, and there have been others which are not terrific, but this is the worst one yet.
Thank you. This is KPFK Los Angeles. We are on the air live with Mark Lane, March 11th, 1992. The discussion, his 1991 book, Plausible Denial. Was the CIA involved in the assassination of JFK? Containing detailed, under oath testimony in United States District Court, which has been not terribly successfully suppressed by our what is it called now? The intelligence community. Hello.
Hello. I have a question concerning Lyndon Johnson's role in all this.
I don't think there was one. I think it was important from the viewpoint of the CIA that Lyndon Johnson be a witness to the assassination. Remember, John Kennedy was ending the war in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson saw what took place, what happened to him, and very shortly after the assassination, the body was still hardly even cold. And Lyndon Johnson said to Bill Moyers, I've told the Joint Chiefs of Staff they can have all the money, all the men, all the material they want. John Kennedy's policy of withdrawal died with him that day in Dallas. Lyndon Johnson got the message.
And so that's about as far as it went with him then?
I think so. I don't see any evidence to show that he was involved.
Okay, thanks. The testimony of his mistress is not to be accepted, to be viewed with suspicion.
If she's had a lot of different stories, and they've been developing year after year after year, and they keep on changing. But the last one, so far as I recall it, was that Lyndon Johnson said that he's not going to be a problem anymore, but didn't indicate that he was planning it, but I guess they had heard something about it. I think that's as far as she goes.
Hello?
Hello. Very interesting show tonight.
Okay, you've got a very bad line. Just ask a quick question. And
Hey, I was wondering on the Jonestown thing if Mark Lane had read Michael Myers' book.
No, I don't know.
Jonestown, a CIA medical experiment, if he had any comments.
I don't know about that book. What does it say?
Fletcher Prouty's High Cabal Theory.
Huh.
I'll get off the line. Thanks.
Okay, I'll try to check it out. I didn't know about that book. I'm interested in Jonestown. I was there when it happened.
now you were in U.S. Congress when testifying to Congress with Grace Walden at the time that Leo Ryan went down to Jonestown.
I actually went down with him.
And you went with him.
Yeah. I went from Georgetown, Guyana, into Jonestown with Congressman Ryan. And when there was an attempt to murder him in the pavilion there, I took the knife away from the guy who was trying to kill him. And Ryan later said I saved his life, but then he was killed shortly thereafter, leaving Time magazine to say, well, Mark Lane only saved Congressman Ryan's life temporarily. Sorry, Time, I did the best I could.
Hello?
Hi. Have some information to shed on Bush's connection with the CIA.
Okay.
When I was in high school in '72, a gentleman named Fred Mollick, I'm not sure if you know him, tried to recruit me to go to Georgetown University from the Bronx High School of Science. Georgetown is sort of like a school for spies. But this guy, Fred Mollick, had to quit the Bush campaign the last time around because he was involved in the campaign. He had been in the Nixon White House in 1972 writing down the names. I think it was the Labor Department writing down the names, Jewish-sounding names in the Labor Department. And I don't know if you have any information on this guy, Fred Mollick. He was also suggested to place, I think, the last Attorney General.
I do remember that story.
The last Chief of Staff, Sununu.
Yeah, I do recall that story breaking at the time. I don't have any more information than what you've just said there. I remember reading about it at the time, though. Yeah.
Right, so there might be some connections to, like, Nazi right-wing type people that George Bush is friends with, that he had to get him out of the campaign.
Did you say Mollick tried to recruit you?
But yes, in 1972, at the same time, he was working in the Nixon White House.
Yeah. Okay, it's interesting. We'll look into it if we can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello?
Yes. My question for Mr. Lane is regarding Richard Billings, who was the assistant to G. Robert Blakey in the House Select Committee investigation report. Richard Billings also co-wrote a book with Blakey, I think it was in '83, called The Plot to Kill the President, which was, I think, just more disinformation.
It was a plot to kill the investigation.
Exactly. Richard Billings worked as chief investigator for the Christic Institute Lepenka lawsuit, I guess supposedly lending his supposed expertise on Ted Shackley and the Miami anti-Castro scene to Christic. Do you not think that Christic used bad judgment in hiring Billings, and also, would you trust Billings?
He wrote the book with Blakey, didn't he?
Correct.
Yeah, well, I don't trust anybody who writes a book with Blakey. In terms of the Christic Institute, I guess they conducted their own inquiry, and they were satisfied that he was going to be useful to them, and I'm not going to comment upon their judgment. If he came into my office and wanted to work with me on this material, I would show him the door as he left.
And one other question is, I'm surprised that you would have any hope that Pat Buchanan is not part of the establishment. I think it's clear that he is.
Oh, sure, he's part of the establishment. But this could be a good ploy. I mean, this is George Bush lying again to the American people. This and it seems to me Pat Buchanan is so personally involved now, he may even forget what he's really supposed to be about. But in any event, I think we ought to ask every one of the candidates to take the pledge. Have. Yeah, and what did he say? Who'd you ask?
I've asked Jerry Brown whether he's concerned at all with these issues and wants to bring them out, and he says he doesn't want to deal with any, quote, conspiracy issues, not even Iran-Contra. So,
is that what he said?
Yep. That was at his campaign headquarters in Santa Monica.
How long ago was that?
Back in October.
Well, maybe he's good.
So, I mean, it wouldn't waste a vote on Jerry Brown in that regard.
I think you have to waste a vote on somebody.
Well,
I don't know who to vote for this
Larry
year.
Akron, Ralph Nader, or Ron Daniels, but then in November, vote whoever's running against Bush, obviously.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maybe we could get Nixon back.
Listen, it's almost like the good old days.
Hello.
Yes, hello, Roy. I have a comment to make about Oliver Stone, and I think that if he was right about Kennedy's Vietnam policy, I think that would have led to a giant upheaval, because remember that in 1949, the issue that McCarthy used was who lost China, and the whole McCarthy attack on what he called communists, liberals, and everything was based on that. And what happened was that, according to what Oliver Stone and what I've heard about it, was that Kennedy was planning to withdraw the troops in large numbers after he was reelected. But my question is, don't you feel that Kennedy, if he had been reelected, that there would have been a massive campaign against him, and people would have called him a traitor, and the right wing would try to use this as a way to destabilize the United States? Because I think that at the height of the Cold War, 1963 was the height of the Cold War, and the majority of Americans supported the Cold War policy that started with Harry Truman, that Kennedy would have been greatly pilloried and really hurt. There might have been, I think that it was inevitable that he was killed, because the thing was that the establishment, the military, the agencies were afraid that he was going to sell the country out to what they called the communists, and by withdrawing from Vietnam, they thought that was the first step in a sellout. He also, according to what I also read, was he also was going to recognize China, change relations with Cuba, and cooperate with socialist or progressive forces in the Third World, because he felt that he was very disillusioned with the American policy in the Third World with our support of oligarchies, and he was going to work with the socialist forces, and the military and the intelligence apparatus and the people in the government were so afraid and so terrified by this that that's what I think, and I wondered if you agree.
Well, I think there's no question that John Kennedy was withdrawing troops. They were then called advisors from Vietnam. He withdrew 1,000. We were down to 16,500. He said that by the end of the next year, every American would be out of Vietnam. He was killed in November 1963. At the time of his death, less than 100 Americans had died in Vietnam. I live in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill. My wife and I walk down to that wall every once in a while, and there are names up there, 58,000 young American kids, all of whom, save 100, all of whom died after John Kennedy died, and after John Kennedy said, we're withdrawing troops and we're going to end the war in Vietnam. I think that was one of the considerations. He was, as you say, involved in a program for rapprochement with Fidel Castro. His representative was meeting with Fidel Castro on November 21st, 1963. And in Plausible Denial, we show all the documents, all the records, all the conversations that took place with Bill Atwood and other diplomats. Atwood also was the publisher of Look magazine.
Do you agree that they felt that he was selling out?
Oh, yeah.
They felt that eventually
Hunt said it. These guys said
they
it.
felt would mean the end not only of American power in Vietnam, but American power all over the world.
No doubt about it. That's what the CIA was saying. They said that Kennedy was going to abolish the Central Intelligence Agency. There was probably going to be a Kennedy dynasty of 16 years. They expected John to be reelected in 64. They expected Robert to be the head of the new intelligence organization, and with that credential, may be elected in 68 and may be reelected. They saw the death of the CIA, and in Plausible Denial, I cite the statements made by the high officials of the CIA said the office had become a tomb. The corridors were tombs, people getting drunk in the afternoon of the CIA. They knew they were finished, and they feared a Kennedy dynasty. A few shots were fired. That was the end of the Kennedys.
But American power, not only the CIA, but they were afraid not only of the CIA going down, but the American economic and political system, and its replacement by a system that would be maybe closer to a Soviet or a socialist system. Eventually that would happen, as you know, that whenever an empire withdraws from its overseas possessions, it becomes more oppressive at home. And they were fearful that the whole thing would fall like a ball of wax. It would be like when you take a string out of a thing of yarn and you pull it, the whole thing comes out. And they were, and it wasn't just the CIA, but the whole government and everybody who were aware of what Kennedy was doing were afraid that not only would they lose their positions, but they were afraid that the whole country would go down. I mean, I don't know. That's what I get out of just reading about it, that they were fearful of the whole American system going down.
Well, they were concerned that there was going to be a new realignment, that John Kennedy was going to have a rapprochement with Fidel Castro, that he had said to Fidel Castro through his representative, forget the Monroe Doctrine. You can pursue socialism in the Western Hemisphere. You can't export terror and revolution. You can't be an agent of the Soviet Union, but you can pursue socialism in your own country. And I offer my hand in friendship and support. And, of course, the people in the CIA and those to whom they reported would rather drop a nuclear bomb on Havana than work out a deal with Fidel Castro. The same was true of Vietnam, and the same was true of the abolition of the CIA. All of these things were very, very troubling to people in the CIA and to those to whom they reported, and they resolved these political questions with a few bullets.
And as a matter of fact, in Plausible Denial, Mark Lane makes a strong case from the point of view of the intelligence community of acting in self-defense.
As they would see it, yes.
As they would see it.
Not what I call a legitimate self-defense claim, but as they would see it, right.
Hello?
Hi. How long is the wait?
You're on the air.
Oh, I'm on the air. That's good.
The wait is over.
How you feel about the work of Mae Brussell and Dave Emery and concerning the Nazi link?
I don't know Dave Emery. I know some of the work of Mae Brussell, but I haven't looked at that in a long, long time. I think what we have to do is not theorize, but deal with the evidence and the facts, and the evidence is very clear now that the CIA killed John F. Kennedy. It's not a question of guessing anymore. We have evidence which has been submitted to a jury, subjected to cross-examination, and we have a jury's conclusion, we have testimony, and I think that's the way we have to go now.
Right, I understand that, but when you say CIA, do you mean the history of the CIA, what it is?
Well, I know who they are, and I know that the Nazis helped to set it up, as a matter of fact.
Right. Would you care to comment further on that?
Well, yeah, it was Richard Galen, who was a Nazi, who came to the United States, just as Werner von Braun set up our space program. Galen helped to set up our intelligence organization, and it's operated as if it was an intelligence organization working for a totalitarian state rather than an intelligence organization for a democratic society. But in terms of specifically who they reported to, this is the next stage which hard evidence cannot reveal at this time. That's what we need a special prosecutor for.
Well, the
Get
control
these guys,
group, the money group, who were they?
Well, that's what we have to find out, who gave the orders.
Right. And what about the Torbett document? Have you ever heard of that?
No.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, well, if anybody wants to send you any documentation, Mark Lane's address in Washington, D.C. is Mark Lane, 105 2nd Street, Northeast, Washington, D.C., 20002. It's 105 2nd Street, Northeast, Washington, D.C., 20002. You can expect to get a couple hundred copies of the Torbett document.
I guess we'll see it. Yes, well, that'll be good. I'll be happy to look at it. I'd like to stay longer, but it's 2 o'clock, and I have my next engagement at 6 o'clock in the morning, and that will give me the longest night's sleep I've had in the last 2 weeks, but I don't want to be falling asleep on the air. So
Okay.
I think we have to go now.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark Lane, for staying up this time to appear on Pacifica Radio. I hope we didn't treat you too bad here
Everybody
tonight.
was very, very nice tonight. I want to thank everybody out there.
Going to
for
get
being
me
so
kicked
nice.
out of KPFK that way. We're not going to follow the example of our sibling stations.
Right.
The book is Plausible Denial, 1991, and is published by Thunder's Mouth Press, New York, now at this time number 4 on the
But
New York.
it's slipping. Everyone has to go out and buy several books quickly. It's slipping off the New York Times list.
And if you think you've heard pretty much all of the major evidence in the Kennedy assassination and you haven't read this book, you have some surprises coming. Thank you very much to our engineer, Diane Schmidt, and thanks, Steve Jaffe.
Thank you.